All right, shall we get started?
Sure.
Awesome. So as I was saying, usually I structure these presentations in sort of a well-structured PowerPoint slides with jokes timed here and there. But today what I wanted to do is do it a little bit more informally. Because I really wanted to highlight that a lot of the concepts around using AI as part of your software development lifecycle, as part of your day-to-day, can be as simple as using the ChatGPT app beside you. And so what I've done is I have structured all of this in terms of a single README file, which contains screenshots of everything that you can do as an engineer, as a manager, as a tester, even as a director, to use ChatGPT in your day-to-day and develop alongside AI to bring the benefits of human and machine intelligence. Hopefully everyone can currently see my README file that's within my editor. All
Yeah.
looking good?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so what are we going to do today? Well, what I hope on doing is walking you through the standard software development lifecycle and demonstrating how AI can be used as a tool to enhance and accelerate the amount of value you get from that stage of the lifecycle. What this presentation won't be is a top 10 tips and tricks and tools available to use AI systems. The reason for that is because I'm trying to make a talk and a presentation that's useful, not just for the tools that exist today, but the tools that will exist tomorrow. And so what I've done is I've tried to keep the tooling as simple as possible. We are just going to go through the ChatGPT app, and we're just going to use its insights directly. No GitHub Copilot, no Microsoft 365 Copilot, no fancy tools like Figma and Whimsical or anything like that, and using its AI-powered resources. This is just what you can do today, because what's important is not necessarily the capability, but rather the mindset we need to go in it. And for folks asking, yes, of course, this artwork was generated using AI. Main point I want to sort of demonstrate is that we are currently on an accelerating curve of AI development and AI research. You can see the number of published publications year by year, and you can see this is going up at an exponential rate. So the tools and tips and tricks that are going to be relevant today may not be relevant tomorrow. We may have already eclipsed it. But what is going to stick around is the process that we use to incorporate these tools in our day-to-day. So what am I doing? Well, in order to do this talk, what I have done is I have done everything with ChatGPT on the left-hand side here. I'm using the iOS app primarily because I really like the ability to talk and communicate with computers using natural language. I'm using screenshots here because I know that sometimes the availability of these kinds of services can be on and off. And I didn't want this presentation to be mostly a waiting game, waiting for ChatGPT to give the insights as we talk. So you will just have to trust me that this works, but you can always go directly to the presentation itself. I have linked it in a public GitHub repository, and you can try these tips and tricks out for yourself and see exactly what I'm seeing. The only way in which I am enhancing this a little bit is that I am using GPT-4 instead of 3.5 because I wanted to give the best results for this kind of presentation. So let's start off with the high level. What is an SDLC? What is the software development lifecycle? The truth is, every company will have its own modifications to the software development lifecycle. But what matters is getting an example that broadly communicates the steps of developing, of designing, of deploying and monitoring software in production that typically tracks what most companies do. And so I have taken a standard SDLC template and added a few additional steps to show you some development specific capabilities for this audience. In general, it typically works like this. You start off in a discovery phase, where your goal in the discovery phase is to really try to understand clearly and succinctly what the problem you're trying to solve is. Discovery is not actually about designing software. And anyone that has seen a developer come to you, and maybe you've been this developer yourself, where you've designed this beautiful solution that would make Uncle Bob Martin fall to his knees in joy, doesn't end up in production because it doesn't actually solve a problem. It doesn't solve a business case. This discovery phase narrows down on problem finding and really making that clear. It's only when we move into that next phase, the design phase, where we can start to think more clearly and more succinctly around what kinds of solutions we want to offer to solve this problem. And this is where we get folks like UI and UX, skills that I don't have, into the process and into that solutioning mindset. I've separated architecture, software architecture, as a distinct phase of the SDLC because I think the tools and practices you can use while incorporating ChatGPT in your process are a little bit different than what happens in the typical UI UX design phase. And so I've separated that out. Afterwards, we have our typical project breakdown. This is, of course, using our Jira boards or Azure DevOps or Trello or whatever your fancy software you like to use, breaking down this solution that we've had into sizable chunks and units of work that we as developers can then action on. Of course, then we move into development. This is hands-on keyboard, writing code, writing the solution. Testing comes afterwards. A lot of SDLCs show development and testing as two separate processes. So I've done that here. Of course, in reality, you should be testing your software as you're developing it in a proper test-driven development mindset. We'll get to that a little bit later. Then we need to make sure that this code that we write gets deployed somewhere so that it can be installed in a regular and predictable fashion and on an environment that allows it to scale based on the usage of your solution. And then last but not least, of course, we have to maintain software, right? We have to make sure that the software is running, that we can see what's going on, and we can use the insights that we get from maintenance, from observability, and feed that back into solving the problems of tomorrow. But before we talk about the problems of tomorrow, let's talk about the problems of today. So this example comes from a real scenario where I have been taking music lessons recently. And when you tell people that you're a software engineer, maybe many of you on this call have had this experience, people will immediately start pitching you their app ideas as if it's extraordinarily easy to make a highly functional, highly scalable website in the span of a week. But what I liked about this example was that the music teacher had a real problem that he needed to solve. He wasn't just in that solutioning mode. The problem is that taxes are incredibly complicated, especially for right-brain people. I mean, it's complicated for me as a more left-brain person, right? And every year, a musician has to file a certain amount of expenses and tax write-offs in order for their, just to not only save money, but also because, of course, providing music to others is a business in and of itself. And so Canada has these long documents that specify the tax requirements, specify the different kinds of ways you can file your taxes as a musician. And of course, in typical bureaucratic fashion, there are multiple steps and multiple conditionals and multiple paths that you need to understand. And this is a bit confusing. At least this is the high level sort of problem that we might want to solve. And maybe we can use our solutioning alongside the software development lifecycle and incorporating ChatGPT, and notice how we can use ChatGPT to really accelerate some of our progress as we move through these stages. So let's go through the first stage, which is discovery. Again, our goal here is to define a problem, right? In the simplest possible terms, what is the problem that you are trying to solve? So there are many ways that we can use to solve problems. There are many frameworks and there are many stakeholders that are involved in discovery. It's not just a designer. It's not just a salesman or a marketer. You need to understand a lot of different contexts. But for our example, I want to introduce a framework that will allow us to think about discovery, and of course will allow us to then use automated tools to generate some results. And that is the 5 whys framework. We typically think about 5 whys in terms of understanding root causes, especially when software has outages in production. But 5 whys, of course, is just a root cause analysis tool that can be used at any step of the SDLC and at any step in life. And just as asking why can get you to the root cause of a production outage, asking why can get you to the most narrow, simplest possible terms problem that you are trying to solve. So how should we get there? How should we try to explore what the problem we're trying to solve is? First thing I asked our ChatGPT tool is to begin. I sort of described the problem a little bit. I described basically what I said before, that taxes are a little bit frustrating for musicians to file. And ChatGPT gave me these 10 questions that I can then go to my user, in this case, my music teacher, and ask him about. Things like, what are some of the specific challenges? How familiar are you with the tax system? How do you manage and store receipts? Are you dealing with any resources or training? What would an ideal solution look like? Just very exploratory questions. And then ChatGPT recommends that if you start to notice and start to uncover the problem as you're talking to your user, you can then start to do 5 whys from there. So what did I do? Well, I think these 10 questions are a pretty good start. So immediately I popped on a call with my music teacher. I just used a software like Zoom or MS Teams to record the conversation and most importantly have that raw transcript. I've sort of filtered out some of the transcript here, but this is a real conversation that I did have with my music teacher on Monday about this problem that we're trying to solve. And what's interesting here, going through these sort of 10 questions that ChatGPT asked us to do, you can see that really the problem is not the whole scope of filing taxes as a musician, but rather the specific and narrow problem that transportation costs can be challenging. Because he does use an existing tool. That was one of the questions that ChatGPT asked me to ask. And he is using this Wealthsimple tax tool, which does a pretty good job of walking you through the process, even though it's kind of complicated. But calculating transportation costs, where you as a musician may drive out of town and you need to understand your mileage and you need to understand how what the gas price was that day, and maybe you need to collect a receipt, and then you need to then go back and file it, is a bit cumbersome. Right now, he's just taking photos of his receipt, and if he remembers, uploading it to a cloud storage solution, right? But that effectively means that when he goes back to his taxes, he has to do this weird cross-referencing approach where he's then has to somehow go back and try to find or estimate the price of gas for that day. It's pretty unreliable. So at the end of the day, we sort of get to this idea that maybe the problem we're trying to solve is that we have some mismatch between the way that he's currently tracking transportation expenses and the way that he's filing the rest of his taxes, and how that relates to the gigs that he is booking when he has to go out of town. So what do we go from here? Well, here's where we can then start to apply our 5 whys. And what I have done, I sort of asked him these 10 questions and then used ChatGPT to then ask for where we should try to poke and prod, so I can keep asking the 5 whys from there. So I asked him, tell me a little bit more about the challenges. He was saying that he typically drives out of town in order to do that. And so why is it challenging to expense driving expenses? Why is it not challenging to expense instruments and things like that? And so we get to an understanding, well, it's the gas receipts. He needs to take a picture of them and store them somewhere. Sometimes he just forgets about the gas receipts entirely. And so, I then ask him, why do you have to end up estimating if you lose these receipts? Well, of course, the reason is because the price of gas changes on any particular day. And, as you continue to go down these 5 whys, I then asked him about the system that he uses to keep track of this. And then finally, asking for sort of a root problem that we can solve, which is consolidating and integrating the system that he used for gigs, which is largely his calendar, and the system that he used to track his expenses. Now we have something a little bit more concrete. Simplifying the Canadian tax code is a really hard problem to solve. Consolidating calendar systems with an approach that allows you to track transportation expenses is a little bit easier. You can see here, I then asked ChatGPT, I plopped in that transcript and then said, given everything you've seen above, what do you think the root problem is? And ChatGPT said, well, there's a lack of an efficient system to track and consolidate expenses for out-of-town gigs. And this leads to estimation and potential inaccuracies during tax calculations. I would maybe add that this is not really a potential inaccuracies problem, but more an inefficiency problem. It's a pain point. It's annoying to do so. And so I asked for it to be simpler. It says, well, the musician struggles to accurately track and manage transportation expenses for gigs. So what did ChatGPT do for us? Well, obviously, it didn't do anything that we couldn't have done ourselves. We could have created a list of 10 questions. We could have poked and prodded for the 5 whys analysis. We could have gone through those transcripts and understood the analysis more. But ChatGPT just made it a little bit easier for us. And we can combine our human approach of getting on a call and just chatting with someone with the AI approach that is really useful for analyzing conversations and large amounts of data and suggesting templates of where to go next. So ChatGPT turned what may have been, let's say, a couple hours of investigation and combing through the transcripts and coming up with these templates into less than 30 minutes of work. But of course, if we just have a problem, we're still not writing software, right? Here's where we get into the design phase. And when we think about design, we are now sort of thinking about solution. And finding a solution to a problem is a hard thing to do. And so here, just like we introduced that 5 whys framework for the discovery phase, we can introduce another framework that's fairly common in the industry for the design phase. And this is user-centered design. Now, I am not a designer. I am not qualified to be a designer. And if there are any designers on the call, please feel free to correct any errors in my presentation. But maybe ChatGPT knows a little bit about user-centered design. What it says is that user-centered design is a philosophy that focuses on the users and their needs rather than specific solutions. It approaches designing solutions iteratively and getting prototypes out to users and creating those fast feedback loops. Typically, there are stages in the user-centered design process, including understanding the context of what the problem we're trying to solve is and what a solution might look like, gathering requirements, coming up with solutions, and then evaluating and deploying those solutions to continuously improve over time. It also has some benefits and challenges of using this approach as well. Now, I want to delve deeper into 2 different parts of user-centered design for this talk. The first is defining personas, and the second is defining our use cases. And with that, maybe ChatGPT can help us along the way in designing these so that we can come to more concrete solutions. So I've asked ChatGPT, how do you define a persona? And ChatGPT gives me a pretty good answer, which is, well, a persona is basically the different types of users that exist in the product or the solution that you're trying to solve. And they help us understand what the user's needs and behaviors are, because not every user is going to have these same needs. And so to factor into that decision, you have to think about the demographics of the user, their age, gender, education, occupation, their psychological needs, their interests, motivations, values, their goals, their pain points, how they prefer to interact with solutions, and crafting ultimately that bit of a story, that bit of a narrative about how they may interact with the product and with your solution. They help you sort of clarify who you are solutioning for, not just what. From there, we can then think about use cases, where use cases are meant to describe ways that users will interact with the product to achieve a goal. So if the persona is who, the use cases might be the how that they intend to use it. Use cases have a bunch of different elements to them, including actor, scenario, preconditions, basic flow, alternative flows, exceptions, and postconditions. We won't get too much into the details there. But the point is that even without design experience, I can now get a high-level sense of how personas and use cases can be useful to drive solutions. Now, that's useful for my own knowledge, but really what I would like is to have these personas and use cases filled so that I can use my just go and edit and provide feedback rather than having to generate these up front. And so this is the exact prompt that I gave it. I said, how could we apply UCD to solve this problem of consolidating the gigs with tracking expenses? And given very little information, it then started to define these personas. Keep in mind, this is still in the context of it having a transcript before. But you can see it got pretty good at defining the persona. Well, we have a musician. He's young. It made up a name, John. That's not the name of my music instructor, but he is about 28 years old. He is a male. He's passionate about music. He is time constrained. We do want to sort of simplify this tracking process. And he has pain points around forgetting to save his receipts, struggling with recalling those gas prices, and having to go through a time-consuming process of cross-referencing gig dates and expense reports. On the use cases side, you can see it comes up with two different possible use cases we could do to solve this problem. The first is this concept of a gig-based expense tracking system. So if this user, which it referred to as John, wants to return from an out-of-town gig and log those travel expenses, maybe we need some kind of application that when you open it, you can select your gig, you can select the mileage, maybe even upload any receipts that you may or may not have. But importantly, and this is where one of those challenges gets solved, is that maybe the system can actually recommend what the price of gas might have been based on its querying of the system, so that even if you forgot those receipts, you can still have a more accurate estimate as you go to track your expenses. It also then tries to come up with another use case, which I wasn't even thinking of when we were chatting, which is maybe we need some sort of reminder system to make sure that these expenses get tracked so that he doesn't have to go at the end of the year and have to do all of this cross-referencing. He can just track these expenses as they go. So with that in mind, with these use cases and these personas, maybe we can get to some possible design solutions. And you can see that it's coming up with a bunch of different solutions here for each of these use cases, right? It talks about sort of 4 different areas. And again, all of this is just with me asking it to do the next step of user-centered design. I'm not really giving it a ton of prompts here. So it's saying, well, it'd be nice if maybe this solution had an integrated gig calendar. So you can see in a single view where your gigs are and easily associate that with the expenses. It recommends the ability to be able to upload a receipt and use OCR to extract the date, amount, and expense automatically. I'm glad that ChatGPT as a designer is already introducing scope creep into its designs. Fantastic. Talks a little bit about this gas price assistance. Maybe we can have some sort of service that recommends the price or recommends filling out forms in a certain way based on its knowledge of the day and the location to track that. And then finally, of course, the mileage logger, how far did you go? Because that will be necessary and to be able to understand the expense. Maybe even integrating Google Maps to track how far your distance was. You can even see on the second solution around the automated expense reminders, it's adding in additional design solutions there around maybe you get a notification as soon as you're done a gig. Maybe you, on a dashboard, you have a consolidated view and you can see where all of those past gigs were. Maybe you see a little icon that says, hey, you should make sure to update your expense. Obviously, as a developer, I don't just take anything at face value. I tell it, for example, hey, OCR, that sounds kind of hard. Maybe V1, we could just have a form. I tell it that filling out the gas prices is a really cool idea, but it's not something I really want to maintain myself. If there was a publicly available API, that would be fantastic. We should just use that. And then I talk about, for this reminders feature, maybe we should just start with email reminders, because email reminders are going to work on both, the web and mobile and any other place that the user decides to use it. And maybe email might just be a more effective medium for solving this kind of problem because it's so asynchronous. And so it then incorporates that into its knowledge, and we can go on to creating UI, UX mocks. Here is where I would recommend you bring in that human designer, right? They're going to have the best sense of how to take these design requirements and turn that into something that's visually pleasing for humans to consume. As we get further along this AI revolution, we may see these tools like Figma be upgraded with these with the power of generative AI to do this for you. But the point is that we want to deploy these tools where they're currently most capable, and we as humans can come in as the experts and fill in the gaps. So I think from here, we have a pretty good sense of the design solution that we want to implement, and we can move on to the architecture phase. I want to just pause here and ask if there are any questions or comments or points of discussion that folks would like to bring up. Please don't let this just be an hour-and-a-half monologue. Yeah, Salil.
Hey, I was just wondering what tools were used for speaker diarization and transcription?
The transcription, I was just using, I think it was like MS Teams or something. They have an auto transcribe feature. And then I just copied and pasted that transcription right into ChatGPT.
Gotcha. So it was already transcribed and speaker diarized.
That's right.
Gotcha. Thanks. Oh, great presentation, by the way.
Oh, I appreciate that. I'm glad I'm on the right track. Any other questions, comments, points of discussion before we move on to software architecture?
Yeah, a quick question. At any point, did it suggest any other apps like Wave and using the APIs of Wave to?
Good question. So I did not explicitly prompt it for those alternative solutions. I'm sure if I did, we would go from there. And of course, part of the design phase is, of course, finding those alternatives and finding even simpler ways to solve the problem. So no, it did not come out with that outright, but surely as a designer, you wouldn't just stop at the first idea, right?
Yeah, but I like how you're breaking this down. Thank you.
Hey, Greg, quick question. Was this one conversation this long?
All of this is still one conversation.
So,
what's nice about ChatGPT is that, of course, it saves past conversations. And one of the benefits of using GPT-4 here is that it has a larger context window. So typically what people often come across when they use ChatGPT is they will have this conversation, but then eventually it seems to forget certain details from earlier. ChatGPT-4 has a larger context window, and so that occurrence appears less frequently. It still is possible, and you still do run into it. And even later in the design phase, you'll see, or sorry, the development phase, you'll see where it's probably forgetting a few certain details. But of course, I can always, as a developer, re-prompt that, and then it's on its way.
So about that, sometimes when you have a long conversation with a ChatGPT, it may veer off the topic a little bit, go on tangent, and then you kind of bring it back. And then sometimes you want to bring back that context that it kind of missed. So what do you do? Hey, by the way, I'm asking this question regarding that context that you mentioned, like 50 sentences or 50 prompts ago. Like, how do you bring it back? Or do you just go back and reprompt the whole thing all over?
It's a good question. I haven't found a perfect solution to this. All I can say is that I've found GPT-4 to be better at getting back on track and referring back to previous things in the conversation and answering intelligently. GPT 3.5 tends to be a lot more meandering in that way and a lot more forgetful. Some solutions I've seen in more production-like systems is to, instead of bringing in the whole context at every prompt and then having to forget the context as you go, to integrate some sort of vector database solution. So essentially what you're doing is you're storing additional pieces of context like the conversation into a database. And then before ChatGPT gives a response, it can first query that database for relevant information and use that relevant information in the response.
All right. Thank you.
Do you use delimiters, like, for example, 3 backticks to call attention to a certain context or a certain discussion?
Good question. So typically when I'm writing code or anything outside of natural language, I will almost always use delimiters, and you'll even see that later in the development phase. I have found in other use cases, particularly when using API calls, having delimiters, but also having sort of templates saying like, answer here, or giving it a name like, Zoom assistant, and then answer here, Zoom assistant, can be really helpful as well. Currently, this is just natural language, though. I'm just, typing my responses as I go along, and I try to sort of capture that in the screenshots as well. It's an interesting question in the chat from Daryl here. How do you know if it's actually returning valid information? So it seems like you need to learn yourself first and then use ChatGPT to save time. It's an interesting problem. I was chatting about this with a friend who's also sort of in the software development management space. And he tried to use a tool like ChatGPT, particularly the free version 3.5, to generate a job description for a principal developer. And it gave something so generic and so useless that he gave up. And the way I think about it is try not to treat ChatGPT like an expert. It's not an expert yet. What it really is just a well-read intern. It's a well-read co-op. It's a well-read junior that's highly capable, that can do a lot, but you still need to coach it. And so you'll notice in this process here, there really isn't something that I've asked it to do that I couldn't do myself or that requires sort of a leap of faith, right? Even when we get to talking about development, I'm still using my expertise as a developer to help guide the conversation. I hope that does answer your question. Yeah, I like the way someone put it here. Rustam said, trust but verify. That's very true. All right, maybe we will go along to the next part, which is honestly one of my favorite parts of the job, which is software architecture, right? And one of the interesting things about architecture is that it tends to be highly preferential based on the company's needs. Some companies run hybrid cloud where they need to have an on-premise solution, and so they have that constraint in their architecture. Some companies want to run multi-cloud, and so they want to design a solution that scales to all cloud environments. Some companies have a single cloud environment. Some companies want to run standardize certain languages and tools in the process. And so when it comes to architecture, it's really important to provide GPT that context. If you're using ChatGPT 4, typically a lot of companies will have a architecture or language specification document in something like Confluence. If you're using GPT-4, which has a larger context window, my recommendation is just copy and paste that document into GPT-4 before then starting to ask your questions about architecture, because then it can understand the context for your organization and provide relevant insights. Today, we're going to make certain assumptions. We're going to assume that we are using AWS as our single cloud platform. We're going to assume that we want to be serverless first in our design principle. We're not designing for on-prem. We're not designing for multi-cloud. And we're going to assume that we're going to be primarily focused on web development. Again, these are just assumptions. We could have done different assumptions and ended up with a different architecture. Now, as we've sort of seen previously, whenever we were approaching a new stage, it was always start the new stage and then introduce a framework to help guide our thinking. And there are many different types of frameworks that we can use in the architecture space to guide our thinking. Service-oriented architectures, event-driven architectures, MVC patterns. But what I'm going to recommend as a framework to guide our thinking here is contract-first driven development or contract-first design. Has a different set of names. But basically, the idea is start with your interfaces, start with your API definitions. And the reason is starting here will allow us to focus our conversation on what are the interactions between components and what sort of functionalities do we need to enable for the user. I, as a software architect, have probably more knowledge around how to design the underlying pieces. But starting with the contract, which, by the way, the contract is usually some of the annoying stuff. Designing API contracts, it can be a bit finicky, right? Having the ChatGPT to that allows me to focus on what I can do best. Again, it gives a bunch of advantages to contract first development or contract first design. One of my favorites is parallel development. If you have an API contract specified up front, then I, as a developer, can get started. A tester can get started. A backend developer and a front-end developer can get started at the same time. And do we really need each other to integrate into a final solution? But all the way along, if we're defining our contracts first, we can then start to introduce mocks and other productivity tools that allow us to work in parallel and allow us to speed up our process. So with respect to our ChatGPT SDLC, we want to focus, of course, on the user requirements and reflecting those in API contracts. So let's see it in action. Again, all I sort of asked it was, hey, using contract first development, please generate me a spec of REST APIs. That was just the choice of tool that I wanted to use here because it's familiar with all of you, around what do we need to do to implement this minimum feature. And it gave me a bunch of different stuff around, of course, tracking expenses. But I also sort of realized, hey, an expense is related to a gig, right? So we also need to have a set of requirements around gigs. And I guess if you're using an application, you probably need to incorporate user management. So I'm going to generate you a list of contracts for user management and how to deal with that. Again, this is not something that I prompted with. This is something that it inferred the context and gave me a list of suggestions. I then recognized that the API for getting the gas prices is going to be complicated. So let's just put it behind a API endpoint and then call some third-party service. And it gives me a bunch of suggestions for that reminders feature as well. Now, I'd like to get a little bit more specific. Of course, having these sort of headers, these URLs and verbs is nice, but really what I want is a full contract, right? I want something like an open API Swagger documentation. I want to understand what the body is. So I can ask for it. I say, let's focus on this one endpoint, add new expense. Of these endpoints which are needed, what does a contract look like? And it said, okay, well, we need to create a new expense. So here's the API endpoint. It needs to be associated with a gig ID. It's going to be posting to /expenses. And it gives me this request and response payload. You can see here it's incorporating things like the gas price, the distance traveled, the amount, the date. It even allows a URL to cloud storage solutions. So if you wanted to upload your document, you could do that. One kind of annoying thing about the way it does this is that it has this type for expenses thinking that it's going to allow us to add transportation expenses, which we do want to do, but also meals and equipment and things like that. But of course, this gas price property only is really relevant to transportation. That's my only sort of criticism about what it generated here. It even gave me a bunch of status codes and prompted me to think about how we're going to authorize this request. So as I sort of said to it, I have this one criticism about its design in that it's using this type when really we only want to track transportation expenses. It says, no problem, let me update this contract. It then changes the URL to sort of, again, prompt you as the end user to show that we are only tracking transportation expenses here. It got rid of that type. And I think this final API contract is a much cleaner version. It also has some suggestion around getting the gas prices. Again, there's some anti-patterns that as a developer I can see, right? It's only getting the gas prices for the current day. Again, I can prompt that and tell it, hey, let's update that. But the point is that it's generating a lot of this boilerplate. And I, as a developer, just need to speak with it conversationally and guide it into that right direction. So we have these API endpoints. We have this contract. That's great. We can already start parallelizing on the team. But now let's take a look at how it works for brainstorming backend architecture. And again, I gave it this context that we want to be serverless first. We want to be AWS as a single cloud platform. We ask it, hey, like, what do you recommend? And so it says, okay, well, you have an API. You're going to need API gateway. You're probably going to want a Lambda function to trigger some of this business logic. You're going to want to store the expenses somewhere. So let's try DynamoDB. If you want to store the receipts yourself, you're probably going to need S3. Of course, you're going to need IAM roles and logs and all of that. And it even says, here's some of the workflow for this particular endpoint. Again, I think this is pretty good. There's a couple things I, as a developer, have sort of tuned in on, right? Like, for example, it's saying using the gig ID as a primary key and expense ID as a sort key in DynamoDB. DynamoDB, this doesn't really fit the single table design, especially if we were adding in other entity types. So I might give it that feedback. Even here, for instance, it's using a Lambda function. That's great. I might have started with a step function here because it really is just coordinating between other AWS services. But I think this is a pretty decent design. Again, we have our API endpoint. It's hitting API gateway. We have a Lambda that coordinates between these two. And we need a Lambda to get the gas prices from some third-party service, or just use API gateway to make that external call. This is pretty good. Again, it's not something that I couldn't have done myself, but it's something which, having been given the boilerplate, we can now start to accelerate the time it would have taken to design this. Of course, we can continue this conversation for other endpoints, but I think let's focus our mind on just this create expense endpoint as we focus our conversation forward. Now, before we get to the development phase and really start writing code, I want to take a pause here because we've noticed a pattern, right? In discovery, in design, in architecture, we've done this same process where we first introduce a framework to guide our thinking and then use ChatGPT to follow that framework to provide insights. And then we as humans provide our expertise. This is what I was talking about at the beginning, around not focusing on tools, but focusing on this mindset. Use your software development lifecycle to define and process and systematize your work. Incorporate frameworks into each step that allow you to guide your thinking at that phase. Use AI tools to follow that framework to generate insights, and then incorporate the human expertise to take those insights and take that generation and turn it into a unit of value. And of course, at the end of the day, always refine and reflect on this process and update your SDLC and update your frameworks and update your prompts to make better use of this lifecycle. And as we go along, of course, we'll want to start to integrate other tools and other approaches. before we continue to the really fun stuff, actually there is project breakdown. I don't know if that's as fun, but before we continue on, is there any questions, comments, concerns, discussion points, anything like that? I will open it up.
The images are something you've created, not ChatGPT.
That's right. That's right. Sometimes I do reference an image from the internet, but there's usually a source below it. But these are just me clicking around.
Thanks.
Yeah, Josh.
Hi, Greg. Can you hear me?
I can.
Nice. Great presentation so far.
Thank you.
I was thinking, now that we're in the architecture phase and going into the development phase, there's this question I have regarding prompting and how to write prompts. So a few questions to ask you is, how do you write good prompts, especially in these phases and maybe even the discovery and the design phase? And specifically, how do you know that you're giving too much information? So for example, especially if you're working in a company and you're eager to tell ChatGPT about your new API or about the code that you're working on, would that be too much information that you think that ChatGPT might take advantage of what you're writing? How do you know that you're not breaching your NDA?
Yeah, great question. So I don't touch on prompt engineering much into this talk because it was actually pretty incredible how far we were able to get just by using the first sort of sentence that came to my mind. And part of this is because of this framework approach, right? We're really saying, use this established framework to guide your thinking. But in other contexts, I have had to do some significant prompt engineering. So I'll share a little bit of my insights there. I was currently integrating a tool that allowed us to sort of do a mass migration where we were going from one older technology to one newer technology. And this became a challenge. We were using the GPT-4 API to have a larger context token, but it had exactly this problem that you're mentioning, Josh, which is we gave it a ton of information and it had a really hard time trying to interpret the information that was relevant and further be able to generate the insights that we were hoping. And so came up for us so far, which is basically a couple of things. The first is to give the system a name, right? You can even say, you are Josh. Give the system a purpose for being. You are Josh, and you are my programming assistant. And anytime you then want it to sort of really highlight or keep in mind a certain amount of information or even generate a part of what you're doing from a template, mention it by name, right? To do for Josh, to do for Josh. Hey, Josh, take note of this. That has seemed to be very valuable for us. The other thing was give yourself a name and give yourself sort of as the system a reason for being. Right? If you are Josh and you are programming assistant, I am Greg. I'm trying to migrate 100 UI pages into a modern framework. Once we sort of went from there, we found further that providing some examples, but also providing a template of how you want your solution to be formatted was sort of the best approach. Examples on its own would overfit to the examples and wouldn't really learn anything. The template on its own would hallucinate, but the two really provided a great deal of value. I don't know if that perfectly answers your question. There was another question you had around NDAs and doing that. For that, I would recommend instead of using the OpenAI service, use the services that they have on Azure, which has sort of more enterprise business related data privacy contracts that allow you to use business data and do so in a safe and secure way that a lot of companies find more compliant than just the OpenAI open tool.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Greg.
No problem.
Do you mind if I add something to that, Greg?
Of course.
Yeah, so like best of my understanding, you can also opt out of ChatGPT using your data. There is an opt-out form so that they do not train on the conversations that you're having. And you can also use the API to then not, because they don't train the models on any of the requests that are made using the API. So those are two ways that you can circumvent the challenges that Josh mentioned.
Awesome. I didn't even know OpenAI had an opt-out. See, you're teaching me.
The opt-out, like it says it prevents them from training on it, but does it prevent them from capturing it? Like the language there is unclear. I feel like you need a lawyer to properly answer that question of what they're doing with it.
Yeah, fair enough. There's always caveats in these kinds of things. Any other questions, comments, things you want to bring up? All right, then let's move on to the project breakdown. Of course, now we have sort of identified not just the product solution that we want to implement, but the software solution and how it's going to look. We now need to take all of that value and turn it into a unit of work. Once again, following our ChatGPT SDLC mindset of incorporating a framework and then having the AI tool bounce ideas off of that framework, our framework is going to be very simple. It's going to be whatever Agile, Scrum, Kanban framework your company uses to break down user stories. And I hope that your company does have some sort of framework to break down projects into smaller independent chunks. We're not really reinventing the wheel on this one. I imagine probably a lot of you on the call have already started to use ChatGPT to help fill in details of your user stories. It's pretty good. My recommendation here is when you're doing this, give it the minimum information, the minimum sort of fields that your user story or task or epic needs to be filled out. And so I have said here, hey, let's format all of the value that we've captured so far, given a title, given a description, given some acceptance criteria, otherwise known as definition of done, and maybe given some implementation notes. I said it was optional, and to be honest, it didn't do a great job at some of the implementation notes, but at least it got the first three pretty well. So it says here, for the input expense information, that is that add expense form that we were talking about. It says the title user should be able to manually input transportation expense details. As a musician, John, I want to manually input the details of my transportation expenses so that they can be stored and later used for tax purposes. There's some ACs here around the add a new expense page that has certain fields. It has certain validation rules that they all must be filled in. And we have a submit button on the form. I then realized that having a form is one set of user value, and we can independently we deploy that to users and they can start to receive value right away. And it recognized that the auto-filling of the gas price using this external tool is sort of a separate set of independent user value that we can track in a second user story. And so autofill transportation expenses amount based on distance and average gas price. And as a musician, John, I want the system to suggest an amount for the transportation expenses based on the distance I traveled and the average gas price for that day, so that I can easily input expenses if I've lost a receipt. And this, I think, captures really well the value and the problem that we are trying to solve. Of course, there are other user stories we can start to generate around notifications, but these two, I think, are the ones that are most worth exploring and most worth diving into, and most sort of match the preliminary architecture that we have worked with the AI tool to generate. You can imagine, again, of course, that you expect that tools like Jira, tools like Trello, tools like Azure DevOps are going to start to incorporate these AI-generated tools in the future, so that you don't even need to do this within ChatGPT. You could do it directly in the app. If you wanted to even hack your way through something today, you can imagine using their own APIs to create these stories for you based on a certain structure. We won't do that today. We'll just appreciate the insights that it's given to us so far. Now let's go to the exciting part. And this is this is something that I think is really cool, and primarily what prompted me to give this talk was realizing that we can use ChatGPT for development, but more importantly, do so in a systematic way, in a way that really does, even given hard requirements, give actual proper software solutions and treat AI and human insights as first-class citizens. So again, our process is to introduce a framework to guide our thinking. What's our framework? Well, I hope every developer on this call knows what it is: test-driven development. The idea of using the red-green refactor cycle to guide testing. For folks who haven't heard of this, this is the idea that instead of writing your software implementation first, start writing the minimum amount of test code you need for your software solution to start to fail. That's right, fail. That's why they call it the red stage. Write unit tests until they fail. So your unit tests actually sort of track your customer requirements. They're almost closer to the user than the implementation itself. Then, once you see your tests failing, go and define the minimum implementation you need to get those specific tests to pass. And once that is done, you can then refactor that code to make it look pretty and make it have a clear interface before going back to the red stage and defining more test cases that then cause your implementation to fail. And you stop when you can't define any more user requirements, any more test cases that fail based on your implementation, and achieve other readability and scalability benefits that you care about as an engineer. So what did I do? Well, I decided to start writing the expense API. It recommended a Lambda function, so I went ahead and started to implement the Lambda using this approach. And I will show you the end result first, and then I'll show you the process of how to get there. What I'm showing now is the test itself. And we can see here that it uses a mock DynamoDB. That's that database. It sets up those mocks initially, and then make sure to invoke the Lambda with a certain set of expense data, and then assert that it has been called, it being DynamoDB, has been called with a certain set of data, and that it's returning a successful result. Likewise, I also have a validation case here where I do not one of the requirements. I expect to get an error message with an error status code. Of course, I could have written many more tests, but I just wanted to show you something that definitely works and definitely tracks the happy and error path. And of course, later we could always build upon it to incorporate more user requirements. As for the implementation of the Lambda handler itself, you can see I cheated a little bit by hard coding certain things. But what does it do? Well, it sets up DynamoDB. It takes in an event. It does some simple validation to make sure that the required properties are there. It constructs the DynamoDB object. It then waits to add that record into the database and then returns a success message. If it failed in some way, had an unexpected error, it returns that 500 internal server error. And this is a pretty standard Lambda function that talks to DynamoDB. Now, let's go back to the beginning and start from what it looked like when these files were empty. So I did sort of initially prompt it with this stub. So I set up my Jest framework, and I set up, you can see on the left-hand side is my spec file. Those are the tests. And on the right is my implementation, my Lambda. And below, you can see Jest is running. And importantly, it's running in watch mode so that I can ask ChatGPT for some code, copy, paste it into my solution. And by the time I click save, those Jest unit tests are already running, and I'm getting that TDD feedback. From there, I'm going to go and tell ChatGPT, this is the prompt that I'm giving it. Here is the spec, here's the tests, and here is the implementation itself. I've asked it, let's go through step by step. There was a question earlier about prompt engineering. This is another one of those tools. Let's think step by step. seems to have a tangible benefit for these LLMs. So I said, let's go through TDD step by step, and please start at the red stage. And now you can sort of see how ChatGPT goes between the red stage of test-driven development, of writing the tests, and the green stage. And it's up to us as human engineers to provide that insight of the refactor stage, to refactor it to what we like, before we can then prompt ChatGPT to continue. It gives an overview of what TDD is, and then starts writing our first test, which is creates a new expense when provided a valid input. It gives an input of a date, location, distance, and amount. It calls the Lambda, it calls the handler, and then expects the status code to be 201 and expects the result body to have the successfully created message. This is a pretty good test, right? It's a good input-output test. It doesn't actually assert that anything's in the database, but that's okay. We can always do that later. And so I, again, just copied and pasted exactly what this is. No modifications. It wrote compiling code, and I can see, because, you know, my jest started right away, that it ran the test and it failed, which means, yay, it did its job. It correctly wrote the minimum test it needed until something failed. Now let's keep going. So I quite literally say, yes, let's keep going, because it ended this with, I think it's cut off here, but it ended it with, would you like me to continue to the green stage? So I said, yes. So here's the code that it generates now. This is now the implementation, not just the test. And you can see it's, again, doing that minimum amount it needs to succeed. Return the happy path status when it works. Otherwise, return an invalid, oops, something went wrong, 400 status code. And I copy, paste, no modifications, test passes. Green stage, successful. So let's continue with the implementation of adding another test to the red stage. It then goes and adds this 400 error test, and it does a pretty good job. It notices distance is required. It purposefully does not include it. We expect it to return a 400 status code with some sort of error message. And that is exactly when I copied and pasted what it did. We can see its exact implementation is over here. And we can see our test-driven development failed on that new test, while the old test still passes. Let's go back to green. And it says, okay, I'm going to implement a green stage. And so here it is smart enough to do this check here to assert that certain properties exist. This check didn't exist before. And you can see it's already starting to think ahead a little bit, because it's realizing, oh, crap, I didn't save anything to the database. So it like adds this line to sort of prompt itself a little bit later, but comments it out to make sure that it doesn't affect the test cases that are currently running. And so I copied and pasted, and this is the first time where the copy and paste didn't work out right. I did have to make a small change, which was that it, for some reason, decided to comment out the body, probably because it was trying to think ahead to saving the database stuff. So I just manually saw the error message and corrected the implementation to make that test pass. And now we are 2 tests passing. But it prompted me correctly. I, as a developer, saw that it's not actually saving anything to the database. So I asked it, hey, let's now try to save this record in DynamoDB. Again, giving it that extra context that the database we're using is DynamoDB. And so it says, okay, hey, you're going to have to add something new to your test case. You're going to have to add a new library. So we install this new library, and it gives us this nice sort of setup about how this works. And you can see here, it is creating the input. It's invoking the Lambda, and then it's saying, like, one way to assert that our database is being called properly is to make sure that our mock database, which is set up on this line, is being called with the object that we expect following the DynamoDB pattern. Now, I had to do a little bit of searching to make sure that this worked. Basically, I didn't set up my jest properly, so I had to have that jest global in there. But for the most part, it was a simple copy and paste, and we got our test failing on the specific test that's checking the extra database access. So let's continue on. Again, I just tell it, okay, green, go ahead. And it says, okay, set up your DynamoDB client. You can do that in the first 2 lines. And then do this try catch where you try to add an item in DynamoDB, return it if successful, otherwise return some 500 error. It sort of knew that it needed to add some error handling, but you may have noticed that it did sort of just drop the previous implementation where it added those required checks for the input, right? The check needed to check that the input event had certain required properties. No matter. When I copied and pasted it into my code editor, I saw that those extra tests failed. And so I re-added that, that additional check to make sure that the required fields are valid to make that old test pass. It also does this thing where it's trying to reuse AWS request IDs. So I, as a developer, just came in and said, no, we're going to generate our own IDs. That was pretty easy there. And then I had to do some refactoring in the test case itself to make sure that it wasn't producing any errors and using this mock library property. But ChatGPT did about 80% of the work. I did about the extra 20% to get the glue together. And now we have all tests pass. I also decided to consolidate 2 of the tests because one of them was just checking input output. The other one was checking the input and the database. So I just merged that into one. But our end result using test-driven development was working software, was a working code. And you can deploy this to AWS and run this Lambda and see it saving records in DynamoDB. It's really cool to have this sort of conversation with the computer as you're developing. And the reason this works is not because we are blindly copying and pasting, but because we are being systematic as developers in approaching our software and approaching development. And this tool, I think this approach using TDD is what's going to help us systematize software development in general, where right now you can see it's doing about 80% of the work to get this functionality in there. You can imagine just by systematizing this properly, it can get up to 90 and 95 and 99. And then our focus as developers can focus on the really hard problems where it does need that push rather than some of these easier problems. Before I move on to testing, that was a big section and I think the heart of the presentation. So I want to sort of pause here for, again, any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that.
I have a quick question. When you're doing these refactors, are you letting ChatGPT know that you had to make these changes so that it remembers this for the next prompt?
Good question. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Like adding in this extra jest import, I didn't decide to tell it because it just wasn't all that relevant. But some of this other one here, where was it? I think it might have been, it was this last one here where it just dropped the requirements checking here, the required properties. I did go back and say, by the way, here is my refactored solution so that when you go on to the next red stage, you have this refactored solution in mind when you're generating your next tests.
Cool, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
I was just curious to know how much time you think you saved.
It's a good question. So I think that there was a lot of time saved at the very beginning of getting the basic structure right and getting sort of that boilerplate, that common flow that you typically have in a Lambda, the setting up the DynamoDB, adding in that try catch, it realizing that it needed to JSON stringify the result. All of that definitely saved time. And even if I was copying and pasting from documentation, those are a lot of gotchas that it just got right away. But there was a little bit of a penalty in having to debug some of the errors that it then introduced that caused the test to pass. Trying to, for example, some of this refactoring in the test case to make sure it's using the mock library properly. There was a bit of a cost. I would say this is not a 10x improvement. I would say this is somewhere between a 1.5 to 2x improvement.
Okay, that's still pretty good. And you found it most useful at the setup stage and like the framework, the top level stuff. I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. It's also in other contexts, not related to this example. I found it useful in generating more unit test scenarios as well.
Right.
And, again, using it in that red stage, and then maybe I'm adding in my own expertise in the green stage and the refactor stage.
Right. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
No problem. All right, I think we'll continue along. I won't take up too much time now. Most of the meat of this presentation has been in the design and the development phase. So right now, these are just some sort of side tips as you can continue to integrate ChatGPT into your SDLC. And I'm sure a lot of you are probably already using these tips today. And if you have any more tips, by the way, of how you use it in your day-to-day, please feel free to comment in the chat as well. It's going to be useful for everyone. Let's move on to testing. Again, we need a framework to help guide our mind and guide the tool to give the right outcome. And I think there is no better framework in the testing world than talking about the testing pyramid, which forces us to visualize how the amount of tests, the speed at which the tests run, and the cost of those tests factor in testing our solution, so that we're putting more tests into the tests that are fast and consistent and provide short feedback loops, and fewer tests in the areas of the platform that take a long time or require more maintenance or are not as repeatable. Test pyramid basically works like this for folks that haven't seen it. It's a big pyramid, and the idea is when you're lower on the pyramid, it has this wide base, meaning the bulk of your testing should be this. And as it goes up, there should be fewer and fewer tests. Of course, as it goes up as well, those tests require more time and require more maintenance costs as you start to do them. And so the thinking is we want to have the bulk of our testing be done on the unit testing level. Then on the component testing level, where you're maybe the unit test, you're testing maybe a single Lambda function or a single class. A component testing, you may be testing multiple classes at once. An integration test, you are, using the service, maybe actually talking to, for example, the database itself, but not reaching out to external services. UI and API testing, you are interacting with the service in the way that a user would. And so if that service talks to other services, you'll get those as well. And then finally, manual and exploratory testing to make sure that there are no gotchas that aren't already uncovered by the automated tests. This sort of paradigm allows us to then apply our knowledge of the implementation user requirements and ask us which tests belong where. And that's exactly what I asked ChatGPT. For the add expense functionality, what are the kinds of tests would you add to the system, automated tests, and where would you add them? And it sort of said here, hey, okay, for unit tests, you want to make sure you unit test the handler function, make sure you get the input outputs correct, make sure you have testing around validation, and make sure it's doing error handling for invalid inputs. You should also make sure you're testing the API, the DynamoDB logic as well. You don't need to actually call DynamoDB. You can mock it out, but you want to make sure that it's, for example, marshaling and unmarshaling the data transformations correctly. Just so happens, by the way, that those were exactly the 2 unit tests that it ended up writing in our test-driven development. Of course, if we add any utility functions, those should have its own unit tests as well. On the integration level, that middle of the pyramid, it mentions you should be able to test the interaction between Lambda and DynamoDB to make sure that it's actually properly saving the data in the system as we expect it. You may want to test our Lambda and the external gas price API to make sure that that logic works, and make sure if that gas price logic external service goes down, we have a way to recover. And of course, the interaction with API gateway itself. And API gateway is sort of like an API test, so it sort of blends into that higher level part of the test pyramid, where it's then recommending, okay, if you created a form, make sure you have a set of Selenium or better Cypress tests to check that the form is valid, that the successful and error state codes are displayed correctly, and the form interacts in a way that we would expect a user to interact with. And of course, we've just prompted it to give us an array of tests that we can use to test our software, but we can then go in and say, okay, you mentioned Cypress, you mentioned E to E, here's the HTML for my form, write me a set of Cypress tests. And it does a pretty good job at doing that as well. So don't forget, with respect to testing as well, that ChatGPT can give you ideas for tests. It can even write automated test code. But one of the most useful features that I have found ChatGPT as part of the testing SDLC phase is generating test data. So here's a prompt that I've given it, which is, hey, I'm writing an API test. I would really just like a JSON file with a bunch of different kinds of inputs. And I'm just going to loop through the items in this JSON file and, write a really lean API test from there that is fairly robust. And it says, okay, I'm going to give you a typical scenario for an input expense. I'm going to give you a scenario that has a fairly low amount. I'm going to give you an invalid scenario that has a missing date. And notice that even has this expected outcome error. So you can, when you're writing your test, dynamically determine whether you expect a failure or expect a success, right? It's saying, I'm going to test the case where you have an invalid amount. You paid $- for gas, which I think gas prices only went negative when the pandemic first started and we had a bunch of oil and nowhere to deploy it. But sadly, I think it's more than $2 a liter now. Testing, for example, the maximum length of the description field itself. Right now, it's making certain assumptions. We can make this longer, so on and so forth. This is just a screenshot, but using ChatGPT to generate test data has been, for me, one of the best uses of it, in addition to, of course, different test scenarios. Moving along to deployment. We have tested our software, but it needs to be run on a particular environment. What sort of framework are we going to use here? There's a bunch of different ways to approach deployment. You can imagine checklists and things like that. But let's be honest, as is the case with documentation, there is really nothing better than code. And so the framework, it's just really sort of a process and a mindset, but I'm going to call it a framework here. We should be thinking of with respect to software deployments is infrastructure as code. Infrastructure being fairly loose term. I mean by infrastructure, not just say cloud infrastructure. I mean pipelines. I mean security scans and processes there. I mean everything. That we want to codify this process so that we can rely on automation and have our deployment cost be as small as possible. Because of course, as small as possible is our deployment cost, then that also means as small as possible the feedback loops we can get from the user and from our product. And by the way, having a easy to deploy software, having a codified solution also happens to track empirically with performance software company. It turns out that when you are able to experiment and get software in front of your users quickly, you are able to make better products and make better design decisions that actually track user value, and that gets rewarded in the market. And if we're talking about code, of course, ChatGPT can write code. It can use the same process we used in development. I'm not going to go through the set of steps. I've just given an example here around, let's say you wanted to use Terraform to deploy this Lambda function on AWS, make sure it has the IAM roles and has an API gateway. It gives you that initial template. Is that initial template perfect? No, it is not, but it gives you that 80% so that you as a developer can focus on the 20. The last part is, of course, maintenance. What happens when your tool is in production, and how do you make sure that you can properly monitor and react to system outages as users encounter errors when actually running your tool? And it usually tends to happen at 4 a.m. for the best of us, right? The approach that we want to do here, the framework that we want to guide our tooling and our mindset around, is observability-driven development. In other words, making it as easy as possible for us to understand what is happening in production in the development phase and coding that into the application itself, so that we as maintainers have a broad view of system health. Typically, incorporating observability has 5 different components, right? The first is logs, making sure that you are logging relevant application behavior so that you can go back in time just by reading the logs, understand what was happening, even in those exceptional scenarios. The second is metrics, which I think is often underlooked, but is one of the most powerful tools you can use. Tracking real-time information about your application. This can be things like API response rates, error codes, but even like data related to your application, right? Domain-driven data, like the number of expenses that my musician has added, and other relevant data to get not only sort of operational and system health insights, but also business insights. We can also use traces. Traces are fairly useful for understanding control flow. Let's say you get a random 500 error and you're trying to understand what happened. Having a trace allows you to easily visually go into your system and understand what went wrong, at least what component failed, so that then you can cross-reference with the logs. Alarms, of course, allow you to be notified when those anomalous events occur in production and incorporate automated responses to those events. I think a lot of companies will start putting in a bunch of alarms, but then won't do the next step of, okay, how do we respond to these alarms in a way that doesn't require us making a call at 4 a.m.? Finally, and one of my favorite observability tools is dashboards, right? Ensuring that we have all the relevant information in a single place so that you can look at a graph and understand the health of your system. Or even better, look at a graph and understand how users are interacting with your system. Likewise, ChatGPT can be used not only if you are codifying these tools, like, for example, codifying your dashboards and infrastructure as code tools like Terraform or AWS CDK, but also you can get ChatGPT to get you to think early in the development process of where you should start to add these observability elements. And so our example, it says here, make sure when you're logging both the request and the response so that you can go back and audit your system. Make sure you're logging errors. Make sure you're logging user activity as well, because while your metrics and events may be helpful, having a log as a backup for certain user actions can be really valuable going back in time. With respect to metrics, it gives a bunch of different, I think, great suggestions. How many expenses are being submitted over time? We can track that as a metric. What's the error rate, right? How often do our requests fail? What's the latency of our requests so that we want this system to be as fast as possible? And especially thinking about our database and making sure that its write and read access metrics are have low latency and low error rates and a throughput that can match the request load. Traces, it talks about here, adding traces between different software components. Alarms, it gives us some examples of, hey, if you have a large number of errors, you should create an alarm for that and have an automated response. If your endpoint has a latency above a certain threshold, add an alarm for that. Add an alarm for a service availability, right? Make sure that when you're making a service, you have a proper SLA. And then it finally suggests dashboards. And I think what a lot of software companies do is they focus on this first dashboard here, that overview, that high level, and maybe even have a detailed ones for the team that's monitoring the service. But I think some companies forget that third one there, that we can use dashboards for user activity as well and generate business insights from our dashboards. Of course, you always want a dashboard to have service health as well. So that is it, everyone. Every stage of the SDLC and how we can use AI tools or ChatGPT to guide in our approach using the best of existing frameworks, AI-driven insights, and human intelligence to guide the process. I've updated this SDLC chart to include all of the frameworks that we have used there, and I'm calling it the ChatGPT SDLC. Everyone, thank you so much for your time. My name is Gzik. I'll post my LinkedIn in the chat, so please feel free to connect. And if you have any questions, the floor is open now.
I have a quick question. How much of this is reusable? Like we went through like one slice or one API implementation, for example. how much of it is reusable for like the next one or like a completely different project that you're working on after this one?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What you'll typically find as you're developing these kinds of things is that the logic itself is going to be particular, but a lot of the patterns are going to be reusable. So for example, when we implemented our Lambda, right, we had a handler, we had a response, we needed to JSON stringify that response. Those things you're going to find are pretty reusable. And the way that you incorporate reusability into your prompts is by creating templates. So extracting what you have done for your 1 or 2 methods, making that a template, and then giving that template as a prompt when you do the red-green refactor or any other stages as you go along. And providing that template to ChatGPT makes it even better and makes it less error-prone. So to sort of answer your question, you start off just by implementing it's just like software design, right? You start off implementing a class, you start off with another feature and you have to copy and paste code in that class and you feel kind of ugly. And then the third time you do it, you refactor. It's exactly the same with prompt engineering here, right? You start off generating a certain amount of code and using it. You then give the same prompt and it generates similar code and you're like, there's probably some reuse here. And then the third time you extract into a template and incorporate that in your prompts.
Cool. And thank you very much. That's very helpful. And then how about like shared development? So this is when one person is doing everything versus working on a team where different people are trying to solve the problem together.
Yeah, that's where that story breakdown, the project breakdown really comes in handy because it allows you to sort of take that units of value and parallelize from there, right? So not only can other people, use their own ChatGPT SDLC process, but also it allows you to then sort of chat with team members and say, oh, when I prompted ChatGPT this way, it gave me this. You can start sharing your prompts back and forth. Of course, at the end of the day, it's all code and it's all going to have to be reviewed and all approved by the team, right? You're not just merging this straight to production. And so at the end of the day, you're always generating production level code that is human readable. And that's sort of always the purpose. One thing I will sort of say that's related to this is, a lot of these AI tools are sort of making an analogy between using an AI assistant and pair programming. And I think that analogy is not quite apt because it assumes that the only benefit to pair programming is having someone to offload work to. There are lots of other benefits to pair programming, right? There's the knowledge transfer side of pair programming. There's the bonding aspect of pair programming. There's the fact that you are just incorporating more diverse perspectives into your normal everyday workflow. And so basically, I don't think that these AI tools really replace the need to pair program and work together. What they do is sort of enhance the way that you work individually and perhaps work collectively by focusing on what are the frameworks and what are the processes we need so that we as developers and teams can focus on the 20% that really matters.
Cool. Thank you very much.
I'd like to add to that pair programming now with the ChatGPT is learning how to ask better questions and all of the prompting. There was one site that I saw about the prompt engineering for different scenarios. For example, asking it to explain it step by step is a way for it to slow down its thought processes and link them. And so for you as a consumer of this information, as you were saying, having the different personas talk to each other, it allows it to slow things down and actually suss out the information that you need.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've used personally the let's think step by step prompt quite a bit. And it's kind of funny how just that one magic phrase really does make a pretty big difference.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, do you have any other thoughts on, let's say, Claude 2 or any other? I mean, we spoke about extensively about ChatGPT, and it's a great product, but I was just wondering if you have any thoughts or insights that you could offer on things like Claude 2 or other tools and AI services that you've used and you found to be very useful in your workflow?
Yeah, it's funny. To be honest, I don't have a ton of experience with those other tools. I'm really looking forward to using them and seeing the differences and seeing the types of value that they provide. But at the end of the day, ChatGPT really is the most accessible tool on the market today, and it really was that amazing first impression that really sold you. I don't know about you guys, but when I first started using ChatGPT when it came out in, I think, late November or December of last year, I was amazed. It felt like, the invention of the internet or the invention of electricity. I was just hooked on it, using it like all night long when it first came out. And I think that sort of first impression, right, is gonna stick with its users, and stick with me personally. And so that's why, for me, I haven't even started to look at the other space yet, because I only feel like I'm scratching the surface with what GPT has to offer.
No, I think I agree with you on that. ChatGPT is, in my opinion, the best tool out there. I've used Claude too. Again, I come from conversational AI, so I've used GPT-2. I've used like the models that that BERT and other Bloom and other things that have been coming out. But ChatGPT was definitely that inflection point which changed how generative AI is perceived and used. And like, especially if you're paying for ChatGPT Plus, then it's an entirely, you are unlocking other levels of tools that you would not have been able to even with just the free version of ChatGPT. But yeah, I see your point. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely.
Questions?
Yeah. How do you recommend for like entry-level developers to develop their skills, given that that ChatGPT can do like 80% of the work? So it's not about like just like learning how to code faster or write more code. Like, so what are the areas that as developers like that should strategically focus on to be more valuable and to grow and to be better and add more value?
Yeah, good question. For me, it comes down to two things: understanding the fundamentals and practice. You need to understand the fundamentals. Those fundamentals won't go away. And you can see here, even in this presentation, we depended on those fundamentals in order to use the tool to the best of its ability. But even more importantly is practice, right? Get yourself experience with all different kinds of development workflows, developing different kinds of products and solutions, using different types of new technologies. And don't be afraid to rely on ChatGPT to do some of that work for you. It's actually pretty impressive how much you can learn about what things you didn't know just by watching what ChatGPT tends to output. Right. I know a friend of mine, for example, was starting to get into 3D modeling and had never used a tool like Blender before. Sort of knew that this was the tool in the space, but had never done it before. And so what did he do? Well, he went onto the Blender site, installed the platform, opened it up, was like, oh, there's an interface. I don't know what to do. ChatGPT, what should I do? Oh, there's a way you can add a script to Blender. Okay, write me a script to do this thing. And within 10 minutes, he's already adding meaningful 3D models using ChatGPT and learning about Blender as he is using ChatGPT to help sort of add a guided tour. And if you can do that for a computer program, you can certainly do that for any programming language, for any programming construct, for any product or solution you may want to build out. So please use these tools, use them for the benefit of your learning, because they will accelerate your progress. They won't hold you back.
I guess we can wrap. Thank you everyone for joining today. And Greg, of course, like, it was amazing presentation. It was totally different than I expected, and I learned a lot. Definitely a lot of interesting. I will definitely use some your tips and tricks during my daily work. And I'm waiting everyone in September, join, and it's going to be about 10x engineering. Have a good evening, everyone. See you next month.